Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. Before I get started, I'd like to thank the 102 subscriber for subscribing to this channel. Enjoy the video. This here is going to be about the Bose L1 Model 2 power stand, and it appears that it is not playing at all. The radiators are not working. The B1s and B2 are not playing, which means that the circuitry is completely shorted out. So I'm attempting to fix it using a soldering station that has an air gun and a soldering iron. So I will make my first attempt to check the components and then find out where the short is on the circuit board. So either it's the component or the circuit board. Now let's see what we have here. On this Bose L1 power stand, these are the two amplifiers here. And what I found out was it has a short on one of these components, and I used a multimeter to test it, and it's showing 0 ohms, which means that you have a short on that component. What I did was to take the component out using the air gun and then test the component on the side to see if there's anything wrong with it. And what I found out was there was nothing wrong with that component. But when I checked the circuit board using the multimeter, it was still showing a short. This means that the short is coming from another board, which is the control board or the signal processing board. So this board I took out this chip from is an amplification board. There's two of them. One for the base link or a B1 or B2, and the other board is for the radiators or the 24 speakers. So definitely this board is pretty good. I checked most of the components on it and there were no shorts except for this chip. So let's move on to the signal board or the signal processing board. And what I noticed about this board was that I checked most of the components on them, and I found out that there was a lot of shorts, plenty of shorts, especially here in this part. Just by observing this board, you can see how damaged these components are. Now, most of these components, you can read them. The R stands for resistor, the D stands for diode, and the C stands for capacitor. So right now I'm testing a capacitor by checking to see if my multimeter would make a sound. And indeed it does, which means that there is a short right here on this capacitor. And the other components that are on there, which is the resistor and the diode, those also have shorts on them as well. And just by looking at this board, you can see how damaged it looks. It doesn't look clean. So when I looked at it, when I took off the board and I looked at it very carefully, this is what I saw. These components that you're looking at are extremely tiny. They're about the size of a grain of sand. And in order to see them, you need to use some kind of magnification. So I don't have a microscope, and my only magnification I have is a cell phone. And it zoomed in pretty good, and I used it to test the components and remove the components. Right now I'm testing this resistor, and definitely it shows a short, this capacitor as well. And this diode also shows a short both ways. Let's move to another part of the board. We're going to look at this SK34 and we're going to test it to see if it's functioning correctly. Now, the top part of it is the negative and the bottom part is the positive. I set the multimeter to diode mode, which means that when you put the positive on the negative and the negative on the positive, the reading should be 0. Now, if you put the negative on the negative and the positive on the positive, the reading should be 0.7 or 0.5 or 0.6. That's how you know that this diode is functioning properly. But right now, I'm getting a reading both ways. I'm getting continuity both ways, which means that it has a short. Now this one here is functioning pretty good. On the one side is 0.5 or 0.6, and then when I switch it around, it has no reading, which means that this one is functioning pretty good. But the first one is not. The first one definitely was having problems, which means that we have to remove that component and test it on the side. So we're going to do two things. We're going to take out the component, put it on a piece of cardboard, and also we're going to test the circuit board to see if the circuit board has the same reading. Also, we're going to remove some of the other components that are showing a short, and we're going to test those as well. I placed the multimeter in continuity mode to see if it makes a buzzing sound, and indeed it does both ways, which means that the short is somewhere else on the circuit board. So you see, when one component fails, it usually shorts out other components, and it continues to do that throughout the circuit board. So definitely you have a very difficult time trying to find out exactly where it is. What I'm doing now, I'm removing the small capacitors and resistor and testing it on the side to see if it has a short. And as I remove them, I'm testing the component, which is the resistor and the capacitor, off the circuit board. And then I'm also testing the circuit board that had the component SK34. Now, by doing that, you eliminate any confusion that you have between which circuit is causing the short. So it's pretty much a guesswork of trying to locate exactly where the source of the short is coming from. So you have to continuously check each component back and forth. As you take them out, you go back and you check each of them using the multimeter on continuity mode to see if the short is gone. Now, if the short is there and you remove the component or other components, it means those components that you remove are not the problem. I'm using some alcohol here to clean up this mess that's here, and then I could test it again. So here are some of the components, and these ones are pretty small, like I said, with like a grain of sand. So I'm just using the multimeter to test it. It's a little difficult. It's very tiny and very difficult to test. But what I found out was that most of these components, or all of them, is working perfectly fine. There's nothing really wrong with any of these components. The diode mode and continuity mode shows that these components are pretty good. And when you're laying them out, make sure that you don't get them confused. So the components I have here had been laid out in the same order in which I took them out. You do not want to rotate them because they have different capacitance. They look the same, but they're not. They have different readings on them. This SK34 worked fine when I removed it. It's time now to replace it back since the components are fine, which means that somewhere along the circuit board there's a short again. So we didn't actually solve the problem. Now, I got down to this chip here, which is the main controller chip for this processing board or signal processing board. And I decided to remove it to see if the short was gone on the different locations on the circuit board. So here I'm using the air gun to remove it, and it has a lot of pins on it, plenty of pins, in which I cannot check. I do not know how to check that. So when I put back the multimeter and I checked the SK34, I found out that the short was gone, which means that the short was coming from the main signal processing chip. So what I did, I wrote down the number and tried to see if I can order this chip. Now, I went to a site, but I didn't hear back from them on this chip. So I found it to be very difficult to get my hands on this chip, because if I could, then I can get this board working again. But then you got to remember that Bose does not have a schematic for these components. So you don't know exactly which component has a reading. For example, let's say I'm checking these capacitors here. There's a number on there, but that number is not the number of the capacitor, which is in microfarads. So which means that if I was to replace one of these capacitors, how would I know which microfarad is it? I would not know. And the company itself, they're holding the schematics for their own personal use. This chip on the circuit board had no reading, and when I removed it and checked it off the circuit board, it still had no reading, which means that this chip here is completely dead. And it can be replaced, but I decided not to replace it. I decided to stop whatever it is that I was doing and call the company and send out this L1 to be repaired. Now, I'm still waiting on the L1 because they themselves cannot get this thing repaired. It's been more than a month now, and right now, I don't have it. So, let's look at the B1s and B2s that I have. These B1s and B2s and the radiator are connected to the L1 power stand, which means that once the power stand stops working, everything stops working. So you are out of luck if you purchase one of these systems. Now, the best option would be to either repair it, or they give you a discount. Bose will give you a discount on a new Pro 32 with either a sub 1 or a sub 2. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it was helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Bye bye.